Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining today's webinar. I'm Shivam, your host for this session on how to handle deposits, both for the custodial and insured schemes. The webinar is expected to last an hour and will be recorded. By the end of the week, a recording will be sent out to all registered participants. I want to encourage active engagement during the webinar. So if you have any questions, please utilize the Q&A button in the Zoom link, and I'll be addressing your questions at the end of the session. So in today's agenda, the first thing we'll be looking at is just understanding the difference between deposits held in the insured and custodial schemes and the differences in the processes in both those schemes and how to carry out those processes in Arthur. We'll then be looking at explaining the deposit process at the start of the tenancy for both the insured and custodial scheme on Arthur. We'll then be looking at closing the tenancy and refunding the deposit for the insured and custodial scheme. And then finally, we'll also look at an example of how the custodial scheme works between Arthur and Zero and how transactions in Arthur sync across to Zero for deposits held in the custodial scheme. Okay, so I'm just going to now share my screen and show you the Arthur dashboard where I'll be looking at some live examples to go over these 4 different sections. So in the first example, we'll quickly just go into a tenancy and look at how to deal with deposits at the start of the tenancy for both the insured and the custodial scheme. We'll do both these processes under this one tenancy because it is quite a similar process at the start of the tenancy, whether you use an insured scheme for registering your deposits or you use an external custodial scheme for the start of the tenancy. Where there are a few differences in the processes in Arthur is when it comes to closing down the tenancy and refunding the deposits, which there will be differences in those 2 processes. So for the start of the tenancy, the process is quite similar for both on Arthur. Before I go ahead and explain using a live example, just a quick explanation on the difference between the 2. So with the insured scheme, usually what happens is deposits are charged to the tenant. So for the insured scheme, you would raise a deposit charge against the tenant. So the tenant owes you £300 deposit. Tenant then pays that £300 deposit into your bank account, which then you would secure and register in your own bank account. So you hold that deposit as part of an insured scheme. With the custodial scheme, the difference is that once you receive the £300 from the tenant, you then send out the £300 to a third-party custodial scheme, such as the DPS, the TDS. So that's the difference between the insured and the custodial scheme. So those third-party schemes would then hold and secure those deposits until the end of the tenancy and then process the deposit refund directly back to the tenant as part of a custodial scheme. With the insured scheme at the end of the tenancy, as you are holding the deposit in your bank account, you will then be refunding the tenant the money from your bank account. So that's the difference between the insured and the custodial scheme. So just a quick example of the start of the tenancy. So at the start of the tenancy, the first step, and this is similar for both, whether you're keeping the deposit yourself under an insured scheme or you're sending it out to a custodial scheme. The first step would always be to add the registered deposit charge on the deposit statement in the tenancy, because what you're doing here is you're creating an invoice for the tenant to pay £300 deposit into your bank account. So this charge here, registered deposit charge, is what you would always raise at the start of the tenancy. You can either raise this once you have already set up the tenancy from the deposit statement directly, add transaction, and then here, registered deposit charge. And then just add the description, something like deposit charge, date of the invoice, which is date of the charge, paid by the tenant, tenant's name, and then the amount in here. Once you save transaction, that will then go ahead and create this deposit charge. So it can be set up after tenancy creation, or this is something that is in most cases set up once you are when you are setting up the tenancy in Arthur. So in tenancy creation, usually what happens is you add a tenancy on the system. And then you fill in on all these details. So let's just put any unit in there, a current tenancy, tenancy start date in here, just put 1st of May, 1 year. And then in this section here, this is where you add in all the tenancy financial information. So in section 2, you're not actually creating any financial transactions. You're just adding your financial information, for example, what the rent amount is, what the deposit amount is, what the rent frequency is. So this is just monthly, and then rent amount, and then deposit amount here. So once you add in the tenancy information, tenancy financial information here, in the 3rd section, you would add in the tenancy name. You can see that the rent has auto-populated from this section here. So this is your rent reoccurring. And then in the final section, which is all your one-off charges, this is where you'll see that registered deposit charge automatically added with the amount in there from the deposit field there. So this is usually the way you would set up that registered deposit charge at the start of the tenancy. Once you create the tenancy on the deposit statement, then you'll see the registered deposit charge appear at the start of the tenancy. So so that's the first step, and this would be the first step for both whether deposits are held in the custodial or insured scheme. So if this was the insured scheme, once you add the £300, you're then receiving £300 from the tenant. So depending on whether you just use Arthur Financials on its own, whether you use Arthur along with the zero integration or Arthur and the live bank feed, once you've received the £300, then you would then have to process the receipt on the deposit statement. If you are just using Arthur Financials on its own and you don't have a zero integration or using the bank feed, from the drop down, you would just go and pay off the charge, which is currently disabled as this account is integrated with zero. So I'll just untick that. So now what we can do is we can go ahead and pay this off. So here we've just got the description, the date the deposit was received, bank account you received the deposit in, and then add payment. So that's how you would process the receipt in Arthur. So on the deposit statement now we can see we've got the charge. The tenant has paid the £300, so deposit owing is 0. So that's if you're using Arthur Financials. If you are using the zero integration, this receipt would be processed from 0. So you would have your deposit charge sync across to 0 as an invoice. And then you would reconcile that £300 invoice, deposit invoice, against the payment you received in your bank account in 0. And then the sync would then create a £300 receipt on your deposit statement. If you're using the live bank feed, similar to Zero, but your bank feed is set up within Arthur itself, you would go into your bank accounts in financials here and reconcile the deposit invoice against the £300 received in the bank from the tenant, and then that would create the receipt here. So based on how you've set up your financials is how you would create that receipt. So with the insured scheme, that's all you would do at the start of the tenancy. You raise the charge and you create the receipt against the charge. With the custodial scheme, there is an extra step now. So once you receive the deposit from the tenant, you would then send that £300 over to, you would transfer that £300 over to the custodial scheme where that deposit will be registered. So if you are just using Arthur Financials on its own, there is no additional step to do in Arthur because, that's just a transfer you're making from your bank. So there's no way in Arthur here you would record that £300 has been sent to the custodial scheme. You can register the deposit here in the more drop down where you can add the details of the custodial scheme once you've sent the money over. So all this information can be added and any documentation can be added in here as well. But in terms of transactions, you would not create any transactions within the Arthur statement. However, if you are using Zero in your bank, you will notice that once you've received the money, so in this example, it's £500. So let's say we've received £500 deposit. You would then transfer £500 to the DPS, which is the custodial scheme. And then the way you would reconcile this is you would use the create function. In here, who is the payee person the money is going to, or the business the money is going to. So who would be the DPS? What would be the nominal code where you want to account for this in your financial statement? So when you use a custodial scheme on Zero, you would usually have a deposit control DPS account set up, or if you use the TDS, you'd have a TDS control liability set up. So you would use create like that. And then description, you can just put the tenant's name, who that £500 is related to, and then you would go ahead and reconcile. So that would be the additional step you would carry out if you are using Arthur and Zero, because once you receive the £500 from the tenant, that money is sent over to the custodial scheme, and this is how you would always reconcile that sort of transfer to the custodial scheme. We will go in more detail on understanding how these control accounts work towards the end of the webinar. So we'll be focusing on more of the Zero side towards the end of the webinar and just showing you how the transactions, all the deposit transactions sync across to Zero and how everything is accounted for on your financial statements on Zero. So so that's the process for the start of the tenancy in Arthur, for both the insured and the custodial scheme. It is just to quickly summarize, it's quite a similar process at the start of the tenancy. The only difference is that with the custodial scheme, there is that additional step that once you receive the deposit, that money then goes across to the is sent across to the custodial scheme, and you would reconcile that directly in Zero. You would not add that transfer in Arthur itself. So in the next example, we'll just be looking at okay. Can see a few questions are coming in, but I'll respond to all the questions at the end of the webinar. So for the next example, we'll look at the end of the tenancy now. So I've got another tenancy set up for that. So for the end of the tenancy, where you now have to close the tenancy and refund the deposit, there are different processes for the insured and the custodial scheme. So for those two examples, I've set up two different tenancies. So we'll first look at closing the tenancy and refunding the deposit for if you're using a insured scheme. So let's just go into this tenancy. So this is an example of the insured scheme and how we would go about closing the tenancy and processing a deposit refund if you are operating under an insured scheme and you're holding the deposit yourselves, which means you would be refunding the deposit directly to the tenant from your own bank account. So the start of the tenancy was the same. For the insured scheme, you have £500. You pay off the £500 to create the receipt in Arthur to show that £500 has been received by the tenant. That £500 deposit is then held in your own bank account until the end of the tenancy, where then you would then go ahead and process the deposit refund. So the closing of the tenancy process is carried out in Arthur itself from the closed tenancy screen here. Before closing down the tenancy, I would first advise just make sure you look through your tenant rent statement, make sure all rent charges are paid off and you have the correct outstanding amount in here. Any amounts that are still appearing outstanding, any charges that you may still have outstanding at the end of the tenancy will automatically reflect in the closed tenancy screen. So for example, let's say there was £100 rent still outstanding here at the end of the tenancy for this charge. Let's say that the tenant underpaid their rent or part paid their rent, and there was still £100 outstanding. When you go to close tenancy, that £100 will appear in that screen because you then have the option of deducting that £100 from the deposit that's being held. So you could £500 deposit held, and then you take out £100 and then you make a refund of £400. So any outstanding arrears or even credits will appear in the closed tenancy screen when you're refunding the deposit back to the tenant. So in this example, we'll just look at a simple full refund of £500. And then in the next example, we can then maybe look at some deductions where you're not refunding the full amount back to the tenant. You might have some cleaning or repairs that need to be deducted from the deposit before you make the deposit refund. So in this example, we'll just do a full refund. So we go to close tenancy here. And the first step you always do is here you can see the deposit held. So that would be the deposit received amount. First step you always do is allocate to tenants. What we're doing here is we're creating a deposit transfer to rent transaction by allocating to tenants, which means we're now refunding that £500 back to the tenant. So always click on allocate to tenants first. And the rule with this screen is always allocate the full amount. So in this scenario, where we are processing the full £500 deposit refund. However, even if you had some deductions, in this step, you would always add the full £500 deposit amount in here. So the full deposit that's currently held would be added in here. Regardless of whether the deductions, always add the amount you see at the top here, which is the amount you received in here. And then press confirm. So that will automatically create this transaction type, deposit transfer to rent account, £500, which is essentially the opposite transaction type to the registered deposit charge that we added at the start of the tenancy in the deposit statement. So that's the reason we say always add the full amount, because we need to balance off that liability. When we added the deposit charge at the start of the tenancy, we created a liability of £500. By adding now a deposit transfer, we're now balancing off that liability to zeros, which is why it's important you always add the full deposit amount in here. The remittance bank account is your bank account from which you're processing the refund from. Because this is an example of an insured scheme, you would be selecting your own bank account in here. This is the bank account from which you are paying back the £500 back to the tenant from. So in this example, there's no deductions, so we will not add anything in there. And then we can just go ahead and press proceed. The remittance date is just the date you want to process the refund. You want to send the money back to the tenant. So you can backdate this if you sent it a few days ago. That's fine. So you can backdate it based on when you made the refund. And then lastly, just go ahead and press proceed. What that will do is here, this will stop any active recurring charges, and it will also set the unit to available, because the tenancy has been closed and the deposit has been refunded back to the tenant. So that will all process now. And when we go back to the statement, we'll see the tenancy has been closed. So going back to the statement, we can see the tenancy here has now become a past tenant. And that process has created two transactions on the statement. One is that deposit transfer, which is created to balance off the initial liability created by the deposit charge. And that would always match the amount of the deposit charge, because we need to balance off the full liability. And then the tenant remittance basically is just the tenant payment. So this shows that a tenant payment has been processed for £500 against the remittance bank account we selected in the closed tenancy screen. So this is the process of closing a tenancy for an insured scheme. Whether you use Zero, whether you use the bank feed, it's the same process. This is what you would always do in Arthur. And then these transactions would either sync to Zero, where then you would then reconcile them, or they would appear on your live bank feed where you would then reconcile them. So the process is the same, whether you're an Arthur Zero user or just Arthur Financials or Arthur bank feed. So that's an example of closing a tenancy for an insured scheme. We'll now move on to an example of closing a tenancy where the deposit is currently being held in a custodial scheme. So I've got a separate example for that. Okay, just share my screen for that. So this is the example for the custodial scheme. So in this example, we're going to be looking at how to process a deposit refund where the deposit was received from the tenant, and then the deposit money has been sent across over to the custodial scheme. With the custodial scheme, usually what happens is deposit is refunded directly from the custodial scheme to the tenant. So we do have to reflect that in Arthur, because with the custodial scheme, the money is not being paid from your bank account to the tenant. The deposit is being held with the custodial scheme, so they will be refunding it back to the tenant directly. But we still have to follow the closing tenancy process and show that money was sent from the custodial scheme to the tenant and account for any deductions and any claims that you may have from the deposit. So with the custodial scheme, in this example, we can look at two scenarios as well. Usually with deposits, they could be deposit deductions where you're not refunding the full amount back to the tenant for things such as cleaning, repairs. And also there could be scenarios where once you collect that money, that deposit deduction, for example, cleaning, you then need to send that money across to the landlord if you are managing the property on behalf of the landlord. So we'll look at how we can add that on the system. Another scenario is on some occasions, you may have to charge the tenant for cleaning and then process the payment to the contractor, the supplier, for example, the cleaner yourself. So how to deal with that scenario as well, where you're deducting money from the deposit and then paying that money either over to the contractor directly, or you're paying that money over to the landlord if you're managing the property on behalf of the landlord. So what I usually recommend is if in the second scenario where the deposit deduction is then being passed over to the contractor, I usually recommend that add that transaction before you close the tenancy, because then you will be able to add the deposit deduction against the tenant, and then also add the charge to pay the contractor at the same time if you do it from add transaction here. So for example, in the scenario, let's say the deposit amount that's being held is £500. So let's say there was £50 cleaning that needs to be charged. The tenant needs to be charged for that by deducting it from the deposit, and then the £50 needs to be sent over to the cleaner for the cleaning. So the way you would do that, usually add the transaction in on the statement before you go ahead and close tenancy, because that allows you to add the two charges together. So you can do that by clicking here, register deposit charge. And then you can see here we're adding a charge against the tenant. But if you tick this box here, oh sorry, that's not the charge. You would use disbursement charge recharge, because you're charging the tenant and then recharging the contractor. So you would tick this box here, which allows you then to add the charge against the tenant, let's say for £50. Then in here, you can just put cleaning. And then at the same time, we can then add the charge for the contractor. So this is now creating a bill for you to pay the contractor. So this is why I say it's best to do this before you close tenancy, because then with the add transaction, you can add those two charges together. The £50 deposit deduction, charging the tenant, and then the £50 bill, which is what you then need to pay the contractor. Here you select the contractor and then put the date in there, and also add the contractor transaction type, which will usually be the same as the tenant transaction type. And then go ahead and save transaction. So here we can see we've added the charge, £50 charging the tenant. And if we switch over to the contractor statement, we've also now added a charge to pay the contractor £50. So you'll be transferring the money you'll be transferring the contractor £50 once you have deducted that £50 from the deposit that's being held and received from the DPS. So that's added on the statement. If we then go ahead and close tenancy, and we're looking at the custodial scheme, the first step is always the same. We'd go ahead and allocate to tenants. And similar to the previous example, always put the full amount in here, regardless of the deductions, because we are adding the deductions in separately. So full £500 that was received from the tenant, and press confirm. So we can see it's now saying we need to refund the tenant for £50 because that cleaning charge has appeared here that we added against the tenant. In another scenario, if we now have another deduction that we need to pass over to the landlord, like for example, a repair that needs to be done, that needs to be deducted from the £500. For the landlord side, we can do it from here. So click add deductions. And you can use the same transaction type, use disbursement charge recharge. Here, the date, and then you can say repairs. Let's just say another £50 and then add. So now we're deducting a further £50 from the £500 deposit. You can see refund amount is now 400. And then we have this tick box here, which then will automatically create a £50 payable to the landlord on the landlord statement. So this is quite useful because in the scenario where £50 has been deducted from the deposit and then needs to be sent across to the landlord, if you're managing the property on behalf of the landlord, tick this box, which will then create a transaction on the landlord statement that you can then remit to the landlord for £50. So go ahead and press proceed once that's all sorted. But before you do that, another important step is the remittance bank account. So in this example, we're looking at the custodial deposits. So as I said, the remittance bank account is the bank account from where the refund is being made to the tenant. With a custodial scheme, the DPS or the TDS or any other custodial scheme will be making that £400 refund directly to the tenant, and you'll be receiving the claims of £100 from the DPS. So it's really important that you change this bank account to a DPS control account or a custodial control account, which you should have set up if you're using a custodial scheme. So that's a very important step, because if you leave it as your own bank account, that will misstate your bank balance, because it will create a payment of 400 leaving your bank. So it's important you change it to DPS control, because the DPS is refunding the money directly to the tenant for the custodial scheme. So go ahead and press proceed. And then you stop your rents, recurrings, and make the unit available and press confirm. So once this is done, we'll look at the different statements. So looking here, we can see all the transactions are remitted. So they've all been included in the 350 remittance. Here we can see the closing tenancy transactions. So this is the cleaning charge we added before we closed tenancy. This is the deposit transfer rent account, which was created from allocating the deposit. And then this is the repair we added for the deducting as a deduction from the deposit. So here we can see that's the tenant remittance amount. And then here we can also see, by ticking that box, which was credit property owner box, when we added that repair, it created this disbursement charge here of -50, which is now money you can then remit to the landlord. So this is £50 you can then send across over to the landlord. So this will be included in your remittances from your financials and property owner remittances. This will be a transaction that you can then process as part of a remittance and send the landlord that £50 you collected from the deposit. On the contractor statement, based on what we added, we can also see the £50 on the contractor statement, which we can then pay the contractor £50 for what we collected from the deposit. So that's an example of how to close a tenancy in a custodial scheme. So the important step, the difference between the insured and the custodial scheme is just making sure you're selecting the correct remittance bank account in here. So make sure that if your deposits are registered and held in a custodial scheme, you're selecting that control custodial account. And if your deposits are held by yourselves as part of an insured scheme, you're selecting your own bank account. So that's the difference. Otherwise, the process is similar in terms of allocating the tenants and adding all the deductions. The only difference is the remittance bank account, which needs to be changed when you are operating under custodial scheme. So we've looked at the first two sections here, so we've looked at the start of a tenancy for both insured and custodial scheme. We've also gone through the process of deposit refunds at the end of the tenancy for insured and custodial schemes. What we'll go through now quickly is zero, specifically how deposit transactions sync across to zero, just so you have an understanding of how the charges we've added in the custodial scheme, how they're all accounted for in your financial statements, and how everything is syncing across to zero. Okay, just going to share my screen for that. So with zero, let's just go into a different tenancy for that example. So I've got a different tenancy set up for zero integration. And I'll explain how all the different transactions are linked to zero. So let's look at this tenancy here. Okay. For this example, I'll just open the mapping screen as well. So you have an understanding of how the deposits are mapped to zero, the different deposit transactions we've gone through today, how they're all linked to zero, and how they all flow into your different nominal codes on zero as well. So if we go back to the start of the tenancy, so this is an example where we're just going through repeating the example of the custodial scheme, but how everything goes across to zero. So at the start of the tenancy, and even for insured scheme, the first step is the same. So as we discussed at the start of the tenancy, you would first raise your registered deposit charge of £500. And then you'd create a receipt. The receipt is created based on how you use financials. If you use financials with zero, you would be receiving £500 from your tenant. So if you go back in here, in your bank feed on zero, you would have £500 coming in your bank paid by the tenant, and then you would be matching the registered deposit charge in Arthur here against the payment in the bank from the tenant, and you press OK. So this is not the same example, it's just different example, but the match will appear here as £500. That's your registered deposit charge invoice, and then the payment coming in of £500, and then you'd press OK. The sync will then automatically create the registered deposit receipt in Arthur and populate your deposit statement. So that's how it would work with zero. If you're not using zero, you can pay off this charge manually from here and pay off charge, and that will create the receipt on the deposit statement. So the registered deposit charge that's raised, the way it syncs across to zero is it's a liability. So I'll just open that charge on the mapping screen. Here you can see the registered deposit charge is usually mapped to a current liability account. So, which is by default, it would be the tenant deposit liability nominal code on zero, which appears on your balance sheet. So every time you create a registered deposit charge on Arthur, it syncs across as a current liability to this deposit liability account. So it creates a credit balance. It credits your liability account, meaning that it creates a liability in your balance sheet. Because what you're doing is you're collecting a deposit from a tenant, which at the end of the tenancy is payable back to the tenant. So that's why we account for this as a liability. So in this case, when we raise a £500 charge on Arthur, this registered deposit charge syncs across to zero and credits the deposit liability account, creating a liability. I have this report open so you can see that in here we have, this is the transaction of £500. So you can see it's credited the tenant deposit liability account. So on the balance sheet, it's appearing as a liability. However, once you've received the £500 from the tenant, in the custodial scheme, the next step on zero is then to transfer that £500 to the custodial scheme. And we looked at this briefly. The way you would always reconcile that money sent to the DPS is using the create function. So we're not matching that transfer against an invoice or a bill. So it's a transfer, so we use the create function. The who is who you're paying. So you're paying the DPS, that £500. And then here you would always use the DPS control account. So this is another liability account that's set up if you're using the zero integration. So with custodial deposits, there are two liability accounts set up on zero. One is the tenant deposit liability account, and one is the DPS control account. So they both transactions are flowing in and out of both these liability accounts for custodial schemes. So once you transfer that £500 to the DPS, we'll go ahead and reconcile this. Always choose that deposit control account. You can put a description, deposit for, you can write the tenant's name in here. Write the tenant's name in here, and then you can also select the unit and property this is related to. So that would have synced across to zero. So all your units will appear here, all your properties will appear here, and then just go ahead and press OK. So this is always how you would reconcile any money you're sending to the DPS that you've received from a tenant. So click on OK. So once you reconcile that, if we go back to this report and refresh it, what that then does is it creates a debit balance. Let's put today's date. Put the two liability accounts, tenant deposit liability and DPS control. Update that. And here we can see that's the credit balance created from the registered deposit charge raised on the deposit statement. And then by doing that create function transfer here, we can see that then creates a debit balance. So once you've received the money from the tenant and once you've sent it out to the DPS, those liabilities, those two liability accounts will balance down to zero because you've got 500 debit credit and £500 debit, and your liability accounts balance down to zero. So that's the start of the tenancy. At the end of the tenancy now, we're going to look at the process of closing the tenancy. So let's just close the tenancy. Let's just do this one. £500. We've gone through this process. And because this money is being paid from the DPS, we change this to DPS control, that one. And then let's just say there's a deduction here of £100. So disbursement charge, repair, £100, add, and then cancel. So we process that refund back. We've changed that to DPS control. So what we're doing now is we're processing that refund back to the tenant. So looking at the two transactions that get created by this process, we can see, first of all, the deposit transferred to rent account. At the start, we said this is the opposite transaction to the registered deposit charge. So what that will do is it will sync to 0 and it would debit the tenant deposit liability. So that's the registered deposit charge, £500 credit. That will sync into this tenant deposit liability and create a debit. So this control account for that tenancy balances down to 0. And then the £400 deposit refund, when we close the tenancy, we selected the DPS control account. So that will then sync across to this DPS control account and create a credit balance of 400 here. So you've got 500 debit, 400 credit. We still have a credit of, we still have a debit of 100 remaining because we've done the £500 debit when we did the transfer to the DPS. We now have the 400 credit from that deposit tenant remittance we created. So that £100 is usually sent as a claim to yourselves by the DPS because you're not refunding the full 500, you're claiming 100. So the DPS would usually send you £100. And then the way you reconcile that is any money received from the DPS would be the same way. Put the DPS amount in there and then put the DPS control in here. And then you can just put the description, repair, claim or something. And then reconciling it this way will create that £100 we're missing in here. In the DPS control account, as you can see, and then obviously the 400 hasn't synced over, but when the sync does run, this £400 remittance will then balance off the credit, the £400 difference between these two. So that's how all the deposit transactions sync across to 0. If you do it the right way, your DPS control account and your tenant deposit liability account should match because all the transactions you're doing in Arthur affect both these accounts. So it's important you carry out the right processes in Arthur to ensure these two control accounts are balanced. So we'll now just look at a few of your questions. Feel free to add any other questions in the chat and I'll respond to them. Okay, I'm just going to go through some of these questions. So the first question I received was, you use reposit. Is there any way to show this on Arthur? We currently use tags to note when a tenant has a reposit. So if maybe you just give me some more information on what the process is with reposit. Do you collect the deposits yourselves? and then transfer it to the to Reposit, or is the entire process carried out in Reposit as well? And then I can show you how that would be reflected in Arthur. If you want to go through that process separately with myself, you can reach out to me and we can schedule a call to go through the Reposit process. So I have a good understanding of what you're doing with Reposit, and then I can explain how to reflect that all in Arthur. Um, so another question is, when setting up the tenancy on Arthur and the tenancy is in approved status, the deposit charge is not showing. Um, I think in this case, it doesn't matter what the tenancy status is. When you set up the tenancy in Arthur, and add the deposit charge, even if it's an approved tenancy, it's not yet a current tenancy, maybe it's still in the prospective status or approved status, it will usually still show the deposit charge. So whenever you set up a tenancy on the different statuses, that doesn't affect the deposit charge. So you have all your different statuses here. If you set an approved tenancy, as long as you're adding, just make sure you're adding the deposit transaction in here at the end. Sorry, I'll just share my screen. So I was just explaining that whenever you set up a tenancy, and regardless of the status, whether it's prospective, approved, and so on, as long as you ensure you've added the deposit in here, it will create the deposit charge on the deposit statement. So the approved status, the different tenant statuses do not affect the charge creation. As long as you have it in here, it will ensure when you add the tenancy, you see that deposit charge on the deposit statement. So just add in all the information in here and just make sure you have the deposit charge in here, and that will create the deposit charge for you. Okay, and the next question. Yeah, so this video will be sent out to everyone who attended the webinar and whoever registered as well that couldn't attend. So this will be sent out by the end of the week. All our webinars are on Arthur's YouTube channel as well, which will be uploaded probably sometime next week. So if you have missed any webinars in the past, if you go to Arthur Online YouTube, you will be able to watch all our webinars in there, and this one will be uploaded there as well. So next question. So I've got a few comments where it seems like the remittance was created for the incorrect amount. The deposit was 500, but the deductions were 100, but it seems the remittance was created for 350. I will look into that. It should have been created for 400. I'm guessing there were some of the transactions on the statement that were probably still outstanding, which is why it created for 350. But generally it will create for the deposit that's held minus any outstanding transaction. So it should in that example, the two charges 50 and 50, it should have created the remittance for 400. So yeah, I'll look into that, but it will just take the deposit held amount minus all your outstanding transactions minus any further deductions you had to calculate the amount that's refunded back to the tenant. So I've got another question. How do you deal with repeating management fee? So Do you mean as a property manager, you're charging a management fee for the rent collection and managing the property? Um, so I'll quickly go through this process, even though it's outside of deposits. But usually with the management fees, when you're setting up a tenancy on Arthur, so you, as part of the tenancy setup, you can set up the management fees in Arthur that you're charging the landlords. So you would add all the information in here. And then when it comes to the third section, you would add the rent charge. So if you're managing the property on behalf of the landlord, the transaction type you would use is always rent charge, not direct rent. Um, so let's say the rent was 1,000. And then this is the invoice date when you want to charge the rent and the period the first rent is related to. So you're charging on the 1st of April, 1st of May for the month of May. And then in the next section here is where you would add any landlord reoccurring charges. So if you need to charge the landlord a management fee based on rent received or rent charged, this is where you would set it up. So you would set it up as a management fee charge here. And then these are your different options. So you can either charge management fee based on rent received as a percentage based on rent received or percentage based on rent charged. So Arthur will automatically generate a landlord charge of 10% of the rent when the rent has been paid, if it's based on rent received, or 10% of the rent that has been charged. So whenever the rent charge gets generated, Arthur will generate a 10% charge to the landlord. So this is where you set up your management fee, repeating management fee charges. Then we had another question, how to add charges that would reflect to zero. I think we have gone through that. If I have missed a specific charge that you're using in your deposits that syncs across to zero, just let me know in the chat, and I can explain how that specific charge would sync across to zero. Another question on how do we roll over a deposit if the tenancy has been renewed? So that's a good question. So if when you have tenancy renewals and let's say tenancy has moved into a different unit, or um you've created a new tenancy for the same tenant, but you're using the same deposit that they paid for the initial tenancy. You're not processing a deposit refund. Um, so there are two things you can do there. If you renew the tenancy, so let's say if we take this example, if you're renewing the tenancy, meaning you would just go to the more drop down, change tenancy, and renew the tenancy, it it keeps all the information there. So anything you have in the deposit statement will stay in there. So in the deposit statement, you would still have that £500 deposit you initially received. And in the tenant rent statement, you wouldn't have closed the tenancy because you're just renewing the tenancy. So you're just adding a new period for that new tenancy. In that case, you would then carry out raising the rents in here in the new renewed tenancy. And then when the deposit is to be refunded, then you would carry out that same process of closing the tenancy. So that's if you renew the tenancy here. All the information stays, the deposit held is still there, and then you can then carry on and create the new charges for the renewed tenancy. And then when that renewed tenancy then ends, go ahead and close the tenancy and process the deposit refund. If there are scenarios where the deposit, let's say someone's moving units, so you create a new tenancy record on Arthur, but you're sort of transferring that deposit in the original tenancy to that new tenancy. what you can do in that case is, so you would have the deposit charge in the original tenancy, you would have the deposit receipt, but you wouldn't close the tenancy in the original tenancy because that would create this deposit transfer and also deposit refund, which you're not doing. You're not sending the deposit out. So what you can do is, in the new tenancy, instead of raising the deposit charge in the deposit statement, you can just add the deposit amount in here in registered deposit. So this will be done in the new tenancy. You wouldn't create a new deposit charge in the new tenancy because then you're duplicating that £500 liability when that money is already held by you or by the custodial scheme. So in the new tenancy, don't physically add the registered deposit charge. Instead, from the more drop down, just add the deposit amount in here, 500 in the new tenancy, and press save. When it then goes to closing the tenancy, that £500 will still be picked up from that more drop down. So this £500 actually comes from the more drop down here. So it doesn't actually come from the charge. So as long as you have the amount in here, in the new tenancy, you will still then be able to go ahead and close that tenancy because you would have that £500 available. So don't add the charge in the new tenancy because that will cause a duplication. Just add that in the more drop down, and then that will be available for you in the new tenancy to close. I hope that answered your question. Okay, so we had that question about reposit. Yeah, I think with that one, it's best if you just reach out to me. Either come onto our support portal and then ask for me, or if you have my email, you can email me and we can schedule a call in to go through the reposit process in Arthur. Do we have a webinar recording for Arthur and Zero? Yes, we do. So if you go on to Arthur Online YouTube channel, there will be a webinar on how the Arthur Zero integration works and how all the different transactions you raise in Arthur sync across to Zero. So you will find that webinar in that. And then just another question here. Is it okay to close a tenancy without doing a property owner remittance? Yes, you can still close the tenancy even if you owe the money, if you owe some money to the landlord. So even if you still haven't processed the landlord payment, which is a property owner remittance, you can still go ahead and close the tenancy. So there's no control that stops you from processing the deposit refund if you haven't processed if you haven't paid the landlord money yet for rent or anything else. So yes, you can close the tenancy even if you haven't done the property owner remittance for that property. Another question here. So 6-bedroom house tenancy has been renewed, but only 3 original tenants are staying, and we are getting 3 new tenants. Therefore, I need to create a new tenancy with a new deposit and a new deposit amount. And for the original tenancy, I would need to give 3 old tenants back their deposit. This is through an insured scheme. Would it be possible then to close the tenancy once I have returned the 3 original tenants' deposits? What you can do in this case, so just to clarify, do you use Zero? Just for that question where you have a 6-bedroom house, 3 original tenants who are leaving and 3 new tenants coming in. Okay, yes, you use Zero. Okay. So in that scenario, what I would suggest is, which is which is slightly different method, but this is the best way of dealing with it because you use zero, is instead of closing the tenancy for the three tenants, three original tenants that are leaving, so instead of going into closed tenancy there, um, which when you close a tenancy, it creates that deposit transfer to rent transactions, which then you can do a tenant process a tenant remittance from. Instead of using closed tenancy for those three original tenants that are leaving, add this transaction in manually. Because what happens is when you close the tenancy, you can see everything becomes remitted, and that will affect the three tenants that are still staying in the property and are not leaving. So what I would recommend is for the three that are leaving, add this deposit transfer in manually. So go to add transaction. Um, so see here, you can find that transaction in here, deposit transfer to rent account, and then you'll have all your different tenants here. So for the three that are leaving, just add that transaction manually. So whatever you're holding for each of those tenants, you can add the transaction in there. And you can just say deposit refund. So you can do that 3 times for the 3 different tenants that are leaving. This transaction will then sync across to zero as a credit note. And then what you can do is you can process a refund on that credit note. Let me just see if I can sync this to zero quickly. So yeah, so because you have many tenants in this tenancy and 3 are leaving and then 3 new ones are coming, instead of closed tenancy, add this transaction in manually from add transaction. That will create the same transaction as this one, which we created from closed tenancy, and then run a sync, and the sync will create this in zero as a credit note on the tenancy. So if you go to zero now, it just needs to sync first, and go to the tenant contact on zero. So you can just take the TE number. It's just syncing over. That deposit transfer to rent will appear on zero as a credit note. You'll see when it comes over. And then what you can do is just process the refund from zero directly rather than processing the tenant remittance in Arthur, which obviously you can only do from closed tenancy. If you do a refund in zero against the credit note, it will then sync to zero to Arthur and create this tenant remittance. So once that deposit transfer goes across, I'll show you how to process a refund on zero directly, which will then come back to Arthur as a tenant remittance once the next sync runs. So let's just wait for that sync. It's just going to sync over now. Okay, that's gone over. So if we refresh this, so here we go. You can see that's the deposit transfer we created. Which one is it? It's 121. So it's this one. So this is the credit note for if you add that transaction in Arthur, and then here just do a cash refund. Because you're insured scheme, you can just select the date you want to make the refund, the bank you're paying the 3 tenants from, and then add refund. Once you add a refund, you can match that on your bank against the money you've sent to the tenant, and then that refund will come back to Arthur in the next sync and create a remittance for you. So that's the best way to deal with that situation if you're using zero. Just let me know if you have any questions about that. Um, After 6 months. So another question, after 6 month contract, the tenant is on a rolling contract. How do I mark it on Arthur? 1 month rolling contract. Okay, so what you can do is if if after 6 months someone then moves on to a rolling contract, we do have an automation in Arthur you can set up. So anyone whose current tenancy period is ending can be automatically moved to a rolling contract. What you can do is if you want to do it through an automation, go to preferences here, go to tenancies, tenancy status here. And if you switch this on, this setting here automatically set a tenancy to periodic. What will happen is when if someone is on a roll has a 6 month contract and then after that on a rolling contract, if you turn that on, automatically when their 6 month is completed, Arthur will automatically change that tenancy status from current to periodic, and it'll automatically move on to a rolling contract. So that's found in there in preferences, tenancies, and then tenancy status. So that's the automation. If you want to do it yourself, you can. If that's not happening for all your tenancies, because that will affect all your tenancies going forwards. If you want to do it yourself, just update the status manually. So once the 6 month period is over, go to update status and then just change the status to periodic and add the start date of the periodic, and then that will automatically move them to a rolling contract. Um, just seeing if there are any other questions. So just got a final comment. In that scenario, the tenancy will be renewed when in fact it will be a new tenancy. So I'm just trying to remember, are you referring to the scenario of a deposit being transferred over to a new tenancy, where deposit's not being refunded, but it's just being held for the new tenancy? So in that scenario where, let's say, there's a tenancy and the deposit is not paid back to that tenant, and the tenant, let's say, is just moving to a different property. So if you want to use the same deposit, but not renew the tenancy, instead you would create a new tenancy because it's a new property. Use the same way scenario, where, oh, I see. So you don't want to close. So if you do want to close the existing tenant, you can go ahead and close the existing tenancy. Let me just share my screen. I'm just trying to think about the scenario you mentioned. So that deposit's being held and tenant is not, so tenant moves to a new property, but that deposit is not being refunded, so you can't close that tenancy. So yeah, you can't close the tenancy and you have a £500 deposit. So yeah, you wouldn't close the tenancy. If you want to set up a new tenancy, don't close the initial tenancy because that will then process the deposit refund, which is not happening. Instead, leave this tenancy. So when the tenancy ends, don't close the tenancy, but you can mark the tenancy as passed manually. And then when the new tenancy is set up, for the new tenancy, don't create the deposit charge. just go into the more drop down and register the deposit in here. Because if you do create a new deposit charge, again, you are duplicating that deposit held of 500. So just add the deposit in the new tenancy in here rather than creating a new deposit charge. Okay, so we have another question about holding deposits and how to reconcile a holding deposit. So how do you add a deposit receipt in zero if they only paid the holding fee? It cannot be reconciled since it's different. Yeah, so if they've paid a holding fee, then the process would be on zero. So if we go back to the bank, so let's just say that's a holding fee. With holding fees, you haven't yet usually created the deposit charge. So with the holding fee, you don't have a registered deposit charge yet on the statement that let's just say they've paid a holding fee, which then contributes to the deposit charge. The way you reconcile that on zero is there wouldn't be a match because you haven't set up the registered deposit charge yet. So what you would do is you'd click on find and match. And then at the bottom here, there wouldn't be a match, so you don't have an invoice to match against the holding fee received. So instead, you would use the new transaction button and click on receive money and then change received as overpayment. Always use that because that's what syncs back to Arthur. And then here, make sure you select the tenancy contact in Arthur. The best way to do that is just take the tenancy number there and put it in here. And then if you want that holding fee to sync back to the deposit statement, select the deposit contact. So if you select the deposit contact, that holding fee will sync back to here, which then when you raise the deposit charge, you can allocate to the holding fee. Sometimes holding fees contribute to first month's rent. So if the holding fee is contributing to first month's rent, then select this contact which doesn't say deposit. So that will sync it back to the rent statement. Then you can allocate that to the first month's rent. Most cases it contributes to the deposit. So select the deposit contact, and then that's all. You don't need to do anything else. Just save transaction and reconcile. Once you do that and the sync runs, that £1,000 holding fee will reflect in here as a minus £1,000. And then once you create the charge, you can then allocate it to the charge. So that's how you would deal with holding fees. Oh, sorry, I was not sharing my screen. Let me just quickly do that again. So yeah, I was just explaining that if a holding fee has been received, for example, this is a holding fee on zero, you don't have a match because you haven't raised the deposit charge yet. So you wouldn't have a match in here because on Arthur, you haven't created the deposit charge yet, and you just have a holding fee received in your bank. So you don't use match, you click on find and match, and then go down to this bit here and then click on receive money, and then change this to receive as overpayment. And then in here, so this is the part I was explaining where you can use the tenancy number to make sure you select the correct contact in Arthur. And then you have two contacts. One contact is linked to the deposit statement. One contact is linked to the rent statement. If the holding fee contributes to the deposit that you will eventually raise in the deposit statement here, so you will eventually raise this deposit charge, then select the deposit contact. If it's contributing to the first month's rent and you want that holding fee to sync across to your rent statement down here, and then allocate it to the first month's rent, then use this contact. So Then you just select the deposit contact and then click on Save Transaction and reconcile. Once you reconcile, that holding fee goes back to Arthur to your deposit statement as a credit minus 1,000, which then when you raise the deposit charge, you can allocate to the deposit charge. So that's the process for holding fees. Okay. So I think that's all the questions we had today. So thank you all for attending. Once this webinar ends, you will get a survey. So yeah, if you could please fill in that survey, your feedback will be very useful for us. Thank you so much.